Hello, I'm Kyle Gillum, Manager of Global Strategies and Trade for the U.S. Grains Council, and I'm excited to present to you the 2021-2022 Corn Harvest Quality Report. This is the 11th year of our harvest report, providing data on the quality of the U.S. corn crop each year. This is really just an opportunity to provide tools for better decision making. We discuss and evaluate trends and factors that impact our corn quality. It is an annual series that we try to enhance over time with various, adding in different components to our report and different analyses, just to provide more information to you to make better decisions on your buying from the U.S. Really, the quality export is affected by manufacturers in the U.S. grain marketing system, and so we're going to talk about some of those factors throughout this report. We'll also have our corn export cargo quality report coming out February or March 2022. So look for that to come in the next coming months. All right, so we break the report down into export catchment areas. You'll see that we have the Gulf export catchment area, as well as the Southern Rail and the PNW. So these are our different export catchment areas. Overall, we have 610 samples taken from these 12 states. That actually accounts for 90% of U.S. corn exports just from this area. And so the full report breaks down different chemical composition, protein, starch, and oil. Those factors are also analyzed and measured within this report. And then we look at physical factors such as stress cracks, 100 kernel weight, kernel volume, true density, whole kernels, those sorts of things. And then we look at these 6 mycotoxins in this report. The mycotoxins are taken from 180 samples out of the 610 samples. We don't actually measure every sample, but it gives you a good look at just the overall crop and what we're kind of seeing on mycotoxins for the year. Just a quick overview of the growing conditions. We actually had great growing conditions for the year. There's very favorable April and May conditions led to timely plantings and no problems getting in the fields by the farmers. Pollination occurred a week earlier than the 5-year average, so that helped bring about the crop a little bit earlier, giving it a little bit more maturation earlier. So the late grain field was actually dry and warm, which promoted an early harvest. We had less crop harvested with elevated moisture content. So it actually was a really good favorable growing conditions across the board for the U.S. crop. Let's talk about the grade factors and moisture. This is just the quick overview of the USDA corn quality grades. And we have the 5 number grades 1 through 5, and of course, sample grade is the other grade that you would get. We are going to focus mostly on US number 2 and US number 1. If you look at US number 2 on here, minimal test weight per bushel is 54 pounds per bushel. And the maximal limits 0.2% heat damage, 5% total damage, and 3% BCFM. The majority of U.S. corn that is exported is U.S. number 2. So that's why I highlight that grade. We'll also look at the grade factors on U.S. 1 at 56 pounds per test weight, 3% total damage, 2% BCFM. And so we actually had quite a bit of our crop grade out at U.S. number 1 at harvest. Just want to quick reminder, buyers should always contract the quality requirements and non-grade factors that you're looking for. If you want it, contract it, and that's what will be loaded on the vessel to be brought to you. But keep in mind that final corn quality is impacted by the movement through the export marketing channels. It's a quick overview of grade factor summary. 90% of the samples actually graded at number 1 grade. That's better than 84.7% that we saw in 2020. And then, of course, actually 98% of the samples graded at above a number 2 grade. So just looking at the previous years, you can see that the overall grades come in really well in comparison to previous years, as the highest overall percentage of number 1 and number 2 grade that we've seen throughout the last 5 years. So really an overall great crop just from a grade factor standpoint for 2021. We'll look more specifically at test weight. The U.S. aggregate came at 58.3 pounds per bushel, so that is aggregate grade of number 1 grade, and actually 94.7% rated at number 1 U.S. corn. When we break it down by export catchment area, you got 58.3 in the Gulf, 58.7 Southern Rail, 58.1 PNW. And then, of course, if you look at previous years, 58.3 is pretty close to that average across the board for most years. So we'll talk about broken corn and poor material. This is just a quick overview of how we measure that. The corn is put through 2 sieves, a 1264-inch sieve and a 664-inch sieve. Anything that falls through the 1264th that stays in the 664th is considered broken corn. And then anything that goes all the way through both sieves is considered poor material. Then, of course, anything left in the top sieve that is not corn would be considered poor material as well. And so it's a percentage of what you find through those sieves that we determine is BCFM. All right, so the broken corn and poor material percentage for the year, actually the U.S. aggregate came in at 0.7, and you see that 0.7 for Gulf Southern Rail and 0.8 for PNW. This is actually a pretty good year for BCFM. 96.6% of our samples came in at number 1 grade, and that average is actually lower than the 5-year average of 0.8%. And if you can take a quick look at the historical aggregate by crop year, you'll see that 0.7 is the tied for the best years that we've had over the last 10 years of reports. So whole kernel percentage, this is just looking at the percent of corn kernels that were whole kernels, and that just means that they're free of chips and there's no pericarp damage in the corn. So like in this example, these 2 pieces that have chips would not count towards the whole kernels. So that's what we're looking at here. This is important because whole kernels are less susceptible to mold damage and those sorts of things, making it easier to store that corn. So the whole kernel percentage, the U.S. aggregate came in at 92.3%. And we see when we look at the export catchment areas, we're at 91.8 for the Gulf, 92.5 for Southern Rail, 93.1 for the PNW. So overall, a pretty good whole kernel percentage for this year's crop. And it's not a grade factor, but like I said, it does kind of play into how well you can store corn, and so less damaged corn is actually easier to store. When we look at the 5-year average, this is the same this year as what our 5-year average is, 92.3%. So total damage and heat damage, just a quick note, we never have, in our reports, we haven't had any heat damage, always been at 0%. Because it's always cool whenever we're harvesting, have cold weather for harvest, leading to that average heat damage to be 0%. So total damage, it comes in at 0.7. That's actually lower than the 5-year average of 1.9%. So we actually have a really good year for total damage. In fact, 97.9% of our samples graded out at number 1 grade on damage. So really seeing a good year on total damage for the overall crop. Moisture percentage, keep in mind, even though it's not a grade factor, still important. And these numbers are actually at harvest. So it's before the corn was actually dried. So it is taking a harvest field, the field moisture basically of the corn. U.S. aggregate this year, 16.3%. That's pretty similar to our 5-year average of 16.4%. It's about where we see most farmers harvesting their crop. They want to harvest it as low moisture percentage as possible. Of course, we want to export it at around 14%. So the lower they can harvested at, the less drying has to take place. And so 16.3 is actually pretty good moisture content for harvest, leading to a lower amount of drying that needs to take place for this year's crop. When we look at it by export catchment area, the Gulf came in at 16.8, and then we had lower moisture content for PNW and Southern Rail at 15.7 and 15.5. All right, the chemical composition of the corns, we'll talk about protein here. Protein dry basis percentage came in at 8.4%. It's actually slightly lower than the 5-year average of 8.5%. But if you look at the historical data here, you can see that U.S. corn typically comes in around that 8.4, 8.5% range. And then if you look at by export catchment area, 8.2 in the Gulf, up to 8.9 out of the PNW for protein dry basis percentage. Starch content, U.S. corn typically comes in around 72.2% starch. And that's, again, what we saw this year, 72.2%. The U.S. aggregate, this was a little lower than the 5-year average of 72.4%. Which we saw actually coming out of the Gulf this year. And then, of course, 71.7 out of the Pacific Northwest and 72.2 for the Southern Rail. So this is a pretty standard starch content. Keep in mind, U.S. corn is actually high extractable starch corn, making it easy to get a majority of that 70% extracted whenever you're trying to extract that starch content. But again, looking at the historical data, you see these numbers coming in around 72, a little over 72% on a regular basis. The oil dry basis percentage, it's typical to see 3.8 to 4% on oil dry basis percentage for U.S. corn. This year it came in at 3.8%. Which makes it actually a little lower than the 5-year average of 4%. And then we had similar averages across ECAs. If you look at that, 3.9 for Southern Rail and PNW, and then 3.8 for the Gulf. So fairly consistent on oil percentage year over year as well. Take a quick look at physical factors. These factors provide additional information about the processability of corn for various uses, as well as the storability and potential for breakage handling. The processability, storability, and ability to withstand handling of corn are influenced by corn's physical components. So just a quick look here on this chart. We have stress cracks percentage. Average was 5.1. 100 kernel weight came in at 92.3%. And then, of course, our horniest or hard endosperm corn came in at 81%. So just a little bit more information on stress cracks. It's really the internal cracks in the horniest or hard endosperm. This is most commonly caused is artificial drying, which we had less artificial drying than we had in other years this year due to the lower moisture content at harvest. So less artificial drying typically means less stress cracks, and so that's actually what we see when we look at stress cracks percentage. Again, it's 5.1%. That's less than the 2020 and the 5-year average. So we had 5.8 then and 5.7. So we actually saw a pretty good year on stress cracks. And when you look at the historical aggregate by crop year, you can see as well that it's a fairly good year on stress cracks, which means it should be a little less breakage as it's moved through the export channels this year. 100 kernel weight, again, 34.98 grams, similar to the 5-year average. And if you look at the historical data, we've been fairly consistent over the last several years on 100 kernel weight. Kernel volume has also been pretty consistent, right at 0.28. And that's what we had for the 5-year average, as well as the U.S. aggregate for the year. And then fairly uniform across export catchment areas, 0.27 to 0.29, depending on the catchment area. So those actually play into the true densities. True densities above 1.3 grams per centimeter cubed would indicate very hard corn desirable for dry milling and alkaline processing, and true densities at 1.275 level and below tend to be softer, but will process well for wet milling and feed use. So when we look at this, we actually had 1.252 was our number for this year, and it's actually lower than the 5-year average of 1.257. So a little bit softer this year than the last couple of years, and actual process great for wet milling and feed use. And when we look at that across export catchment areas, fairly similar numbers for each. 1.248 is the low end for the Pacific Northwest, with 1.256 being the high end for Southern Rail. Hornius and hard endosperm, hornius or hard endosperm percentage. Many dry millers and alkaline cookers would lack greater than 90% hornius endosperm, while wet millers and feeders would typically lack values between 70 and 85%. There are certainly exceptions in user preference on these, but this year we came in at 81% across the board on hornius hard endosperm, and that's actually been fairly consistent over the last several years, going in at 81% if you look at this historical data. So that's about where we tend to be each and every year. So quick look at mycotoxins. We test for 6 mycotoxins: aflatoxin, DON, fumonisin, ochratoxin A, T2, and zearalenone. Again, just want to tell you that we tell you this every year, but we want to remind you, the corn harvest quality report shows only the frequency of detection in harvest samples. We do not and will not try, we do not even try to predict the presence or levels of mycotoxin in U.S. corn exports. We can't tell you what those levels are going to be. We actually very much suggest that you test your corn that you buy when you receive it to verify and know what you have and how to handle it, management from there. All we can tell you is what we have found in the samples that we have tested. We targeted a minimum of 25% of our collected samples. That's what we've done the last 2 years. And so that's 180 samples that we tested for these 6 mycotoxins in this report. Quick look, here's the key aflatoxin levels in parts per billion. The key number, of course, being the FDA action level. Everything is off this 20 parts per billion right here for our exports. If a test comes up over 20 parts per billion, that corn will not be exported. It has to be under 20 parts per billion for the exports to take place. And of course, this year's test, the samples with no detectable levels of aflatoxin were similar to 2020 and 2019, with 98.9% of samples tested below the FDA action level of 20 parts per billion. And you can actually see that 98.3% of the samples came in at below 5 parts per billion. The growing season conditions were really just not conducive to aflatoxin development this year, which makes for should be a fairly clean crop across the board. When we look at the historical data here, you can see we don't typically have an issue with aflatoxin. It wants to grow in hotter, drier climates. And so really the only year that we've had an issue was 2012, when we had a hot, dry drought. And in that year, we did see some aflatoxin issues. But historically, on a normal year, we have not picked up really any aflatoxins in our samples that we've tested. The key DON levels, parts per million, the key level for FDA advisory is at 5 parts per million. So that'll be the key number we want to look at here on DON. So our DON testing results, actually, we had 97.2% of our samples come in at below 1.5 parts per million. And actually 0 samples exceeded the FDA advisory level for DON at 5 parts per million. And again, historically, we haven't found much results for DON in our testing. The exception, of course, being 2016 and 2019 even, which were much wetter years, which is more conducive to dawn in those conditions. But the last couple of years, we really haven't had any kind of an issue with dawn as far as our report goes. Key fumonisin levels, the key FDA guidance level for fumonisin is going to be 5 parts per million. So that's going to be the one we're going to look at for fumonisin. So when we look here at this, the percentage of samples below 5 parts per million, we're at 97.2%. Keep in mind, this is just our 3rd year of fumonisin testing. So we'll have more data each and every year as we continue to look for this. But so far, we're really not seeing much fumonisin in any of our crops for the last few years. Ochratoxin A is just our 2nd year to test for ochratoxin. We actually came in at 95.6% of our samples below the 5 parts per billion level. T2 is also the 2nd year for that, and 100% of our samples were below 5 parts per million. And actually 100% were below 1.5 parts per million, which is the lowest detectable level. So we weren't able to detect any T2 in any of our samples. And same thing goes for zearalenone. 100% of those samples were actually below the 1.5 parts per million level as well. So just a quick conclusion, 98% of the samples graded number 2 or better, 94.5% compared to 94.5% in 2020 and 81.7% in 2019. So it really shows you overall, from a grade factor standpoint, a really fantastic crop for the U.S. this year. And then, of course, when you look at it for the individual factors, our test weight was higher than the 5-year average, with BCFM, total damage, and strash cracks being lower than the 5-year average. Just really reiterating that we had a very solid, very strong U.S. corn crop this year. And then, of course, for mycotoxin development, the growing season just really wasn't conducive to mycotoxin development. So we didn't see in the samples that we tested, we didn't see really hardly any mycotoxins show up in those tests. And with that, I will stop here, and I will be available for any questions that you may have. I want to thank you for your time, and I will be available for questions. Thank you.